In the winter of 1287, the Mongol Empire sent a fleet of food to feed an invasion. It carried enough grain to conquer a kingdom. It never arrived. This is the story of the battle that starved an empire, Vân Đồn.
The Battle of Vân Đồn, 1288. No famous river, no legendary charge. Just a disgraced general, a fleet of grain, and a maze of islands. The war that was won without ever winning a battle.
There is an old soldier's truth. An army marches on its stomach. The grandest army ever assembled is still only as strong as the food behind it. Cut the supply, and the giant falls on its own.
By the 13th century, the Mongols had built the largest land empire in history. They had shattered the Jin, swallowed the Song, and under Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty in China. To them, the small kingdom of Đại Việt should have been easy prey. But Đại Việt had already humbled them twice. In 1258 and again in 1285, Mongol armies poured south, and both times they were driven back in retreat. The Tran dynasty had learned how to fight a giant. The defeat of 1285 taught the Mongols a bitter lesson. Their armies had not been beaten by swords alone. They had been beaten by hunger, by disease, and by an enemy who burned the food and vanished. This time, Kublai swore his men would not starve.
So in 1287, the third invasion began. A vast army marched south under Kublai's own grandson, Prince Togon. And this time, they brought their own supplies, a dedicated fleet to feed the war.
The invasion came in three arms. Prince Togon led the land army. The Admiral Omar, O Ma Ni to the Vietnamese, commanded the war fleet. And behind them came the most important ships of all, the grain fleet, under a commander named Zhang Wenhu. Hundreds of heavy transport ships loaded with rice, by some accounts well over 100,000 bushels of grain. The exact numbers vary between the Vietnamese chronicles and the Yuan records, but all agree this fleet carried the lifeblood of the entire invasion. To reach the army in the delta, that grain had to pass through one place, Vân Đồn, Đại Viet's great sea trade port, a scattered maze of limestone islands off the northeast coast. Every fleet from the north had to thread its narrow channels. Guarding that gate was one of the most gifted and most controversial commanders of the age, Trần Khánh Dư, a brilliant, daring general who had once fallen from grace, stripped of his rank in disgrace. In exile, the chronicles say, he made his living selling charcoal. But when the empire came again, Đại Việt needed every able commander. Trần Khánh Dư was recalled, restored, and given command of the sea approaches at Vân Đồn, the very gate the invasion had to pass. Then came his mistake. Omar's war fleet reached Vân Đồn first, fast, armed, and ready. Trần Khánh Dư attacked it head-on, and he lost. The powerful war fleet brushed his ships aside and sailed on toward the delta. News of the failure reached the court. The senior emperor was furious. An envoy was sent north with a hard order: arrest Trần Khánh Dư and bring him back to the capital to answer for his defeat. But Khánh Dư begged for a chance. Punish me later, he argued. The war fleet was never the real prize. Behind it, slow and heavy, came the grain fleet. Let me strike that, and I will turn this entire war. It was a gambler's plea, and it was granted. He was given just a few days to redeem himself. A few days to turn disgrace into the one victory that would decide everything. His plan was simple and ruthless. Let the war fleet go, hide his boats among the islands, and wait for the slow, laden, lightly guarded grain ships coming up behind. Ignore the swords, strike the food. On one side, Trần Khánh Dư, light, fast war junks, hidden among the islands, crewed by sailors who knew every channel. On the other, Zhang Wenhu, hundreds of grain ships, slow and low in the water, and lightly guarded, for the war fleet had already gone ahead. The islands of Vân Đồn were the perfect trap. Narrow channels forced the heavy ships into single file.
Countless coves could hide an entire fleet, and once inside, the slow transports could neither turn nor run.
In the last weeks of 1287, the grain fleet arrived. Hundreds of ships, riding low with rice, threading the channels between the islands, believing the way ahead was already clear.
Then, from behind the islands, the trap sprang shut. Trần Khánh Dü's war junks burst out of hiding, fast and light, closing on the grain ships from every side at once.
The escape was cut off. A blocking force sealed the channel toward the delta, while more boats pressed in behind. The heavy transports, packed together in the narrows, could not maneuver.
Then came fire, flaming arrows and fireboats loosed into the trapped fleet. Ships crowded together, caught and burned, and the grain, the whole point of the invasion, went up in smoke on the water.
It became a slaughter on the sea. Zhang Wenhu fought free with a handful of ships and fled for open water. Behind him, the rest of the great grain fleet was destroyed, captured, or sunk.
Zhang Wenhu escaped, by most accounts, with only a few ships and fled back toward Hainan. He survived, but the supplies he was sworn to deliver did not.
The spoils were staggering. An entire fleet's worth of grain, weapons, and supplies, destroyed or seized in a single action. The sea around Vân Đồn was left littered with wreckage and floating rice.
When word reached the court, the emperor's anger turned to relief. Trần Khánh Dü's victory more than erased his earlier defeat. According to the Đại Việt chronicles, he was pardoned, his disgrace wiped clean by the grain burning behind him. For the Mongol army, the consequences were catastrophic. Prince Togon held Tonglong, but it was an empty city, its people and food gone. Now the grain meant to feed him lay at the bottom of the sea. Hunger set in, disease spread, morale began to rot. This is why Vân Đồn mattered more than any single clash of arms. No army, however vast, however fierce, can fight for long on an empty stomach. Trần Khánh Dü had not beaten the Mongols in battle, he had starved them out of one.
The invasion could no longer feed itself. Facing famine in a hostile land, Prince Togon made the only choice left to him: retreat. The great fleet turned back toward the sea, down a river called Bạch Đằng.
And there, on the Bạch Đằng, Trần Khánh Dü was waiting, with a riverbed full of iron-tipped stakes. The starvation that began at Vân Đồn led the Mongols straight into the greatest trap in Vietnamese history.
As for Trần Khánh Dü, the disgraced charcoal seller became the man whose single strike broke an invasion. His life remained complicated, his reputation forever mixed. But history remembers the general who gambled everything and won.
Vân Đồn is a lesson written in rice, not blood. The most decisive blow of the whole war was not a heroic charge or a duel of champions. It was logistics, the unglamorous art of cutting an enemy's supply. Break the supply line, and you break the army.
Today, Vân Đồn lies in Quang Ninh province, beside the famous waters of Ha Long Bay. Once Đại Viet's window to the wider world, its quiet islands still guard the memory of the winter the grain fleet burned. Much of this story survives in the Vietnamese chronicles, echoed and sometimes contradicted by Yuan Chinese records. The two sides disagree on numbers, on details, on blame, but on the outcome, they agree. The supply fleet was lost, and the invasion was doomed. One fleet, one winter, one war decided not by the sword, but by the rice that fed it. Vân Đồn, 1288. The day an empire learned to starve a nation, you must first survive it. If this story moved you, there are many more battles still to tell.